Welcome to Memphis, 1892. A river city waking under a bruise-colored dawn, the rails shining like thin knives, the cotton bales sweating out the night. On Beale Street, a second-floor office holds a stubborn rectangle of light against the fog, a printing room, a hand press, a woman who has decided that grief will not be domesticated. The names are still hot in her mouth. Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, Will Stewart. Neighbors, grocers, fathers taken, paraded through rumor, delivered to rope and gun, returned to the city as silence. Someone will call it order. Someone will call it justice. She calls it by its right name and turns toward the press. She is not supposed to be here, not at the lever, not at the masthead, not at the fulcrum, where a private ache becomes a public record. Memphis, Tennessee. March breath full of iron and river wants her to fold herself small to let the current carry the story away until it thins to forgetfulness. She can feel the city's old grammar reaching for her hand. Hush, defer, let the gentleman speak. But grief, once it refuses to be tidied, becomes a tool. You can lift it. You can aim it. You can build with it, and so she does, setting each line like a rung on a ladder. She will climb out of fear. Ink, paper, metal, the newsroom catechism. A composing stick on its side, tiny letters spilled like teeth. SOUTHERNHORRORS. The words look back at her with a terrible patience, as if they already know the roads they will travel, the doors they will knock, the arguments they will ignite. Downstairs the stair squeals once, then stills. Outside, a dray clatters over seams in the cobbles. At the river, a packet boat mourns its arrival. The city does not yet know that it has arrived at a hinge, that a woman with a pen will wedge herself between what was always done and what can never be done again, without someone naming it out loud. Here is the arithmetic they expect her to accept. 3 men reduced to a rumor. The rumor refined into a headline. The headline filed into a lesson for anyone who thought prosperity was permission. Here is the countermath she brings. 3 men multiplied by community, community multiplied by witness, witness multiplied by print, until fear cannot divide them anymore. She has counted bodies before. She has counted lies. She has counted the ways authority makes itself pale and clean on the page. She is done counting alone. Listen to the telegraph pecking an impatient code across the street, to the scratch of the typesetter's pick, to the slow inhalation of the lamp when she turns the wick. Listen to a city wearing its church clothes over its appetites. There are men rehearsing the sentence that turns blood into unfortunate events. There are men tasting the word alleged like sugar. There are men advising her to consider her station, her safety, her future. She considers them all and finds them thin. There is a door in the back of her mind that the night tried to shut behind it, the sound of 3 wives naming their husbands into the morning. She opens it again and lets the sound through. She remembers the groceries stacked cool and careful, the credit extended on handshakes, the children who learned prices before letters, and how swiftly commerce becomes pretext, neighborhood becomes threat, ownership becomes theft, when black prosperity dares the city to keep its own promises. People's Grocery, she writes the name slowly like a prayer and a knife, and the ink holds steady. She will be told that agitation is unladylike. She will be told that the facts are complicated. She will be told that the mob is a weather system, not a choice. She will be told to move. She does toward the press. Truth in this room is not a cloud of ideas. It is weight, the pull of the lever, the bite of type into paper, the slick of ink on fingertips that will not wash out even after the water runs clear. She leans her shoulder and the rollers begin to turn. The first sheet accepts its burden. The press exhales a steady, muscular breath. With each impression, the story hardens into something that cannot be talked out of existence. She does not promise rescue, she cannot. She promises record. And record in a city that swears the river forgets is its own defiance. Memphis asks the river to carry evidence away. The river remembers. It remembers bill of sale and hymn chain and cradle oath and loophole. It remembers the first time she printed a name no one else would say, and the night voices drifted under the window like warning and benediction. It remembers that grief, when left alone, rots, and when laid in daylight, ferments into power. She has learned the chemistry. She will teach it. There is a future in this room, not in the soft promise of someday, but in the loud mechanics of now. The future sits in a stack of damp pages and in the muscles of a woman who will not give her fear a chair. It sits in the sentence she refuses to sand down, in the verb she refuses to apologize for, in the simple repeated act of naming. It sits in the way she lifts her eyes to the window and meets the city head-on, as if to say, I know what you did. I know how you call it. I know what you will do next if no one looks. She touches the title and feels heat climbing through the paper. Not literal, not safe, but real. She imagines the pamphlet slipping under a door in the Delta, riding in a carpet bag to a Pennsylvania lecture hall, crossing an ocean to a London parlor, where strangers will understand the arithmetic at once. She imagines a girl not yet born, book and lap name pronounced carefully, feeling her spine arrange itself at the thought that a single woman in a city that preferred her quiet could turn grief into a crusade and sell the truth like bread. There will be a price. There always is. The city will threaten her livelihood, her home, her life. Friends will ask her to wait until it is safer. Enemies will teach her how wide danger can be. She will go on anyway, because standing still is a kind of compliance, and compliance is a cousin of erasure. She is not angry for sport. She is not brave for applause. She is precise. Precision is how you survive the avalanche of denial that begins the moment you say what happened. This is the hour when the hand press becomes a drum. This is the room where one woman's private ache recruits an army of sentences. This is Memphis, 1892, the morning the city learns that its river cannot drown a pen. The proof sheets lift on a tiny wind. She steadies them with a palm still shaking. The tremor passes. The ink holds. Stand with her not later, when statues and syllabi make it easy, but now, while the room still smells of hot metal and courage. Stand with her in the doorway between rumor and record. Stand with her as the first bundle goes to the street and a boy runs and a door opens and a kitchen falls quiet and a name is rescued from the mouth of the mob and folded at last into the archive of the living. Before we go on, add your voice to hers. Tell us where you're watching from and the exact minute you're at right now. If your town keeps a name that history forgot, write it below. If your family carries a story that never made the papers, leave a line for the record. And if this truth matters to you, share this episode so another name is not lost to the river. Then subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of what America tried to erase. Memphis, Tennessee, March 1892. A city built on a broad brown river that never stops remembering. Cotton bales stacked like quiet fortresses along Front Street, wagons creaking past the cotton exchange where ledgers thicken with other people's labor. The air tastes of iron and damp rope flour dust and molasses, wood smoke and printer's ink. You can stand at the corner of Beale and DeSoto and feel the geography pressing in the river to the west, the rail yards to the south, the courthouse squatting like a stone verdict eastward, and between them, the neighborhoods where a black prosperity, thin, fragile, hard-won, begins to show itself in bright shop windows and neatly painted porches. In 1892, the war is nearly 3 decades old in memory. And yet in daily practice, the truce still negotiates its terms. Each dawn, each corner, each pair of hands that dares to own a key. It is a city that talks in headlines and whispers at the same time. Guinea rumor rides the streetcars. Truth travels slower, often on foot, and prefers back stairs. On Saturday nights, Beale Street glows brass music slipping from saloons, Church choirs shaking the ribs of storefront chapels, the chatter of gamblers, the soft scold of mothers tugging children along. And yet, beneath the light, a ledger of rules unspoken, but enforced: who may pass first, who must step aside, whose eye contact is insolent, and whose is civic spirit. Police are not merely officers. They are translators of a custom that tells itself it is law. Newspapers are not merely papers. They are mirrors angled by their keepers. Every institution hums with an old instruction: keep the page clean of what stains the conscience. Before the names became a rope length of mourning, before the night pinned 3 families to a new gravity, there was the daily arithmetic of survival. You can count it: wages, shorted contracts, rewritten taxes, levied licenses, invented permits delayed. You can count the alleys searched, the doors opened without knock, the accidental discharges that always discharge only one way. But you can also count something else: the stubbornness. A grocery co-owned shelves stacked straight credit extended on the faith of ordinary neighbors. It sits at a bend locals call the curve, where track and road crowd each other and commerce threads the needle day after day. In that place, a little American experiment has been running that if you keep your shop neat, your accounts transparent, your ledgers honest, prosperity might be allowed to exist without offense. That experiment is about to be declared a provocation. Memphis learns its news in layers. The first layer is voice a boy shouting a headline no one wrote yet. A neighbor swearing he saw what he did not see. The second layer is paper a headline written as if the first boy were the witness. The third layer is correction. Late, small, quiet, placed below the fold as if truth itself should apologize for arriving out of turn. In 1892, the telegraph stamps out its impatient code across rooftops. The press rooms sweat, commas get positioned like barricades. Adjectives are drift nets. Whole lives are reduced to a fray, disturbance alleged. But a woman has been practicing a different grammar in the rooms of the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight, a cadence that refuses to smooth the stubble off a cruelty that names the thing and does not flinch. She has already learned what it is to be told to move cars, to be dragged from a seat she paid for, to sue to win, to have the verdict yanked back by a higher court, a civics lesson written in bruises and appellate italics. She writes under her name now. She writes like someone who has already counted the cost and is making change. Listen to the city's competing orchestras. In the cotton exchange paper, shuffles boots knock, a clerk coughs price into the air as if it were weather. In the courthouses, quills scratch, gavels tap, oaths bloom and wither in the same breath. In a tiny rehearsal room over a shop, a pastor tests a hymn for Sunday. The high note finds the plaster and holds. In people's grocery, the bell over the door rings, a sack of flour. Thumps the counter, someone jokes about spring planting. Someone else tallies the week's credit, quick math, honest math, the kind communities use to keep themselves going. Meanwhile, in another part of town, the rival store's owner seethes at sums he thinks he is owed by the very order of the world. Commerce is not neutral here. It is a frontier printed on ledgers. And at the frontier line, men who call themselves neighbors become interpreters of who is allowed to prosper. There is a story the city prefers, that violence arrives like rain, unbidden from a cloud. No man authored. A clash, a disturbance, a riot. We are encouraged to imagine the night as a force of nature, lightning choosing its tree. But if you walk the blocks in daylight, you can map the weather in advance. The handbills, the barroom speeches, the sheriff's nods that store in the body like instructions. You can read the coverage before it is written, a paragraph where the men become boys, where the defense of one's own store is assault, where the rope bears no fingerprints. You can feel the courthouse clock slow down when witnesses of color speak, speed up when they are done. You can compute how long a jury will take, not to find the one thing it will not look for. And yet, there is another map. It runs through black churches, through mutual aid halls, through back rooms where women count coins for a neighbor's school fees, through night classes where men learn to sign a neat hand, through kitchens where mothers save a newspaper clipping and fold it into the family Bible because their child's name appears without mockery. It runs through printers who will set the line others refuse, through teachers who will assign the text no one else has seen, through a singer who leads a congregation into a verse the city cannot censor. If rumor is policy in costume, then community is policy in rehearsal. Imperfect, wobbly, but real as hands, helping other hands. The city's gods are paperwork and proximity. Proximity to the levers of cash, to uniforms, to headlines. Paperwork, the false innocence of the form that allows harm to walk in daylight with an approving stamp. But there is also paper that saves affidavits that survived a match marginalia in a ledger that contradicts a sworn recounting a letter that never meant to be evidence yet is. In these streets, paper is a blade that cuts both ways. The question is whose hand steadies it. Inside the free speech office, the blade points in a new direction toward accountability that speaks in complete names. The woman at the press has a practice return the human weight to places from which it was lifted by convenience. Write Thomas Moss in full and do not let the syllables fall. Write Calvin McDowell. Write Will Stewart. Write the store's inventory and the school teacher's salary and the hymn a widow sang when the house quieted. Refuse to let the story set like plaster around the lie, chosen by men who sweep quickly. Memphis, 1892, is reconstruction already narrowed to a corridor. The federal promises that once walked in boots now speak from distant pages. The local rules that once hid behind curtains now sit on porches. Ballots scrutinized, juries controlled, patrols expanded. Order has been coaxed to stand in for justice so often that even good men can forget the difference. And yet, the difference announces itself every time a black business opens and survives the first month. Every time a child brings home homework, no one in that family was allowed to have 10 years prior. Every time a woman writes an editorial that dares to examine the sacred fiction of the unwritten law and does not apologize afterward. Progress is not a staircase here. It is a seesaw, and someone is always climbing on the other end. If you keep your ear low to Beale Street at midnight, you can hear more than music. You can hear the arithmetic of safety being computed in the heads of mothers. Which route home keeps a son from the wrong corner? Which cousin's house is a better place to sleep if men are asking questions 2 blocks over? Which preacher to ask for a note? Which policeman will not read it? You can hear prayers that sound like logistics that sound like song. And you can hear a counter-melody, what the city would prefer, that you should be grateful for the quiet nights, that the loud ones are the price of living near the river, that prosperity must not show off, that self-respect must not be seen at a distance. The morning the rope found its purpose, all these currents collided. A quarrel inflated into a principle accessorized itself with badges. A badge borrowed the confidence of a crowd, and a crowd rehearsed a sentence it called justice. The jail did not prove to be a wall, it proved to be a vestibule. The night did not cover the action, it covered the accountability. And the next day, breath itself felt expensive in certain houses. This is the climate from which a crusade rises, not because someone longs to be noble, but because someone refuses to be quiet in a place that asks quiet as tribute. To say anti-lynching crusade is to risk a tidy phrase, as though the work were a banner and a march, a speech and a resolution, a matter of volume. In Memphis, 1892, the crusade begins in ink and risk. It begins when a woman decides to describe what men misname. It begins with the heresy of specificity dates, places, witnesses, motives, money, the unglamorous ledger that steals the thriller's romance from terror and reveals it for what it is. A collaboration requiring participants who prefer reputation over truth. It begins, too, with a folklore, that will not go away, the whispered dreams of women who saw omens. The porch stories of neighbors who kept hearing a footfall after midnight, where there should have been 3. Fact and folklore meet in the doorway, nod and agree on one essential premise: names matter. The room above Beale keeps its small flame. The press waits. The city inhales, not yet aware that its exhale will carry something new into the avenues. A grammar that cannot be bullied, a cadence that makes denial sound shabby. Outside, the river slides by with its ancient sarcasm, pretending to erase, smugly keeping everything. The curve in the track at the south end of town holds afternoon heat. Children scuff chalk games into the dust. A woman ties her headscarf and squares her shoulders and goes to stand in line where news is sold. She does not know if the paper will tell her what she needs to hear. She knows only that the act of asking is itself a vow. Memphis is a city of ledgers. Cotton ledgers, court ledgers, soul ledgers. In spring 1892, one more ledger opens. Who will stand? Who will sit? Who will sign? Who will pretend they did not see what they saw? The woman at the press has already made her column entries. She writes the sentence that a city will attempt to unwrite with threat, with slander, with exile. She knows the first reprisal will not be argument, it will be force. She recognizes the old choreography: light the fuse under the office, break the windows, teach the lesson. But before the lesson arrives, so does the pamphlet. Before the mob finds its road, so does the mail. And so the stage is set not in marble halls, but in back rooms, not under gaslight chandeliers, but under a desk lamp that stutters when the wick catches. The chorus is ready: editors who will choose cowardice, editors who will choose courage, pastors who will preach safety, pastors who will preach witness, neighbors who will measure risk against loyalty and find both heavier than expected. The city stands between its versions of itself. River proud, commerce, proud order, proud, and the mirror a woman holds up, which refuses to crack, even when the hand that holds it shakes. Memphis, 1892. The year grief learns a new grammar, and a crusade begins to conjugate. I name, you answer, we refuse. They cannot bury what has been printed. When we go forward, we will walk scene by scene, the rail yard, the jailhouse, the office, the pulpit, the parlor, and we will listen for the exact syllables by which men try to turn a murder into an unfortunate event. We will number the letters that travel, the threats that arrive, the doors that close, the doors that open. We will keep the river in view, not as absolution, but as memory's patient accomplice. And at each turn we will ask the same simple question that makes this story a quarrel with forgetting who benefits when a name is lost, and who stands when a name is saved. Memphis decides what is real by how it is told. And in the first days of March 1892, the telling begins as a neighborhood quarrel and ends as a clock that refuses to stop. At the streetcar bend they call the curve, where track and road lean into each other, and wagons must mind their wheels. A little cooperative stands with its back straight, People's Grocery co-owned, co-stocked shelves lined like an argument for ordinary prosperity. Children come in after school and point at crackers. Neighbors settle tabs with a smile and a promise. A postal worker who keeps honest time by day keeps the books by night. Across the way, pride curdles in another shop, a ledger jealous of its own thinness, and in a city that measures respect by who looks away first, even daylight can tilt toward trouble. The quarrel, when it comes, is small enough to fit on a gossip's tongue. A scuffle near the door, a shove, a bruise that blooms faster in the telling than on the skin. But Memphis knows how to put muscle on rumor. Uniforms arrive. The good men are named boys. The word order comes to mean what a certain crowd wants it to mean. And by nightfall, 3 co-owners are in a cell that was built to be a wall and too often performs like a hinge. The city sleeps out loud, freight whistles, river horns, but other sounds move under the blanket of dark, purposeful, and polite boots that do not hurry, keys that know what they are for a door that opens without needing to be kicked. When the air breaks at last, it is with gunfire, not argument. Dawn finds 3 bodies and a silence already rehearsing its excuses. In the morning kitchens, grief is not theatrical, it is logistical. Who will tell the children? Who will find the preacher? Who will stand at the rail yard and insist on a name when officials prefer an inventory? Back at the curve, the bell above the grocery door lifts and falls to no hand. The store still smells of flour and salt pork and something like good intention, and neighbors pass with their eyes lowered as if looking straight at the door could count as provocation. The papers are quick with their adjectives. The courthouse is slow with its duties. And everywhere, respectability clears its throat and suggests that if the men were not perfect, then perhaps the night was not a crime. This is the arithmetic the city offers. Subtract the humanity, divide the blame. Write the remainder in a tidy hand. Up on Beale Street, a second-floor office holds its lamp against the fog. The free speech press rollers at the ready. Tiny teeth of metal type scattered like a jaw after a punch. The woman at the lever has already lived a civics lesson in the key of humiliation. Dragged from a seat she paid for, ruled against, told her signature weighed less than the conductor's convenience, and she has learned the only counterspell that works: write it down. Put your name under it. Mail it where the lie cannot reach as fast. She sets the first line as if building a stair out of a well. No storm metaphors, no gentlemanly fog. Names, places, hours, a grammar that refuses anesthesia. Her office becomes a climate. The telegraph across the street pecks its little law of distance. Up the block, a pastor warms his Sunday throat. Somewhere a boy practices headlines he will not understand until he is older. She listens for the sentence the city loves, an unfortunate event, a necessary warning, unknown parties, and places her own sentence against it, like a brace against a sagging beam. The press breathes a steady exhale sheet by sheet, and with each impression the story hardens into something a neighbor can carry under an arm, something a stranger can unfold in a different city and still see clearly. The answer comes back fast and theatrical. A crowd that pretends to be a weather system finds its way not to a courthouse, but to her door. They do not debate her paragraphs. They debate the audacity of her hand. The office is wrecked, type flung, presses mauled, and the warning left is the kind that speaks of a body, not a byline. She is out of town when it happens, trying to stretch the paper's reach by lecturing in rooms where the air is kinder and the message is plain enough to carry without ink: do not come back. She will not. Exile enters like a draft and becomes her permanent weather. But distance, if wielded, is a megaphone. She learns the venues that carry a voice farther, a hall with high ceilings and restless lights. A paper with a train schedule in its pocket, and she tells the story again, but bigger, but colder, but with the math laid bare. Here is what accusation does when it meets envy. Here is how protection becomes a lever for theft. Here is how a mask calls itself decency while it practices convenience. She speaks in a city that prides itself on seeing past the curtains of other cities, and the room hushes not because the story is new, but because the calendar she unfurls makes denial look crowded and small. Slim pages follow a pamphlet with a spine tight as a fist, a title that refuses to sing. The language inside squeaks with restraint. The argument insists on specificity. When the trail is thin, she says so. When it is wide enough for a wagon, she points at the ruts and lets the reader count. She aims not to inflame, but to insist on dates, on corners, on the uselessness of euphemism. She does not prescribe courage to everyone. She prescribes witness. If the mob's real weapon is the city's appetite for forgetting, then the counter-weapon is memory with receipts. Meanwhile, the curve tries to keep living. Children discover new routes home that avoid the rail yard. Widows learn the price of a stove repair the hard way. A neighbor opens his palm to show a set of keys he did not wish to inherit. The rival shop takes its easy victory with a nervous laugh and a glance over the shoulder. Even beneficiaries can feel the weight of a tilted scale. On Sundays, the hymn descends the stairwell above the grocery and threads the dust with harmony. On weekdays, a woman passes the still door, touches the jamb, and keeps walking, a gesture so small it would not register to anyone who has not learned the rituals of endurance. The city learns, too, what it is to be seen by its reflection from a distance. Letters arrive from places that pronounce Memphis with a tourist's care. Ministers write from pulpits that would be offended to be called radical. Editors who have never set foot in Shelby County adopt a tone of intimate concern. Power resents oversight most when the eyes are unfamiliar. But the woman who lit the fuse of attention is not playing to the balcony. She is trying to save the next corner store, the next husband's name, the next wife's mourning. Her crusade is not a costume. It is a ledger she refuses to let thieves balance. What began as a neighborhood quarrel has become a map. Follow the line, the curve, the jail, the rail yards, the press, the wrecked office, the northern lecture hall, the slim book mailed in brown paper, the parlor 2 oceans away, where someone you'll never meet understands instantly that the word order can be an alibi if no one asks it to show its work. Follow another line back the other way, a mother teaching her child to carry his eyes like a passport. A pastor choosing which verse can say the word justice without the sheriff frowning. A clerk in a dim room copying a name carefully, so that future readers cannot say they never knew how it was spelled. In this third turn of our story, fact is not an academic posture, it is a life-saving device. A name printed becomes harder to steal the second time. An hour recorded refuses to be moved to midnight so that responsibility can be pushed into shadow. A corner identified makes it impossible to say somewhere. And when a woman gathers these details with the patience of someone darning a torn sleeve, the fabric of a community holds long enough to keep other hands from falling through. No miracle has occurred. The men are not returned. The guilty are not struck by late lightning. The city does not wake to sudden shame. The change is quieter, a new habit of insisting, a refusal to let the river write the ending. The press in the borrowed room keeps its rhythm. The pamphlets dry on a line like damp laundry. The sentences march out into weather, get rained on, get folded, get read, get argued with, get saved. And somewhere always a door opens, and a neighbor steps onto a porch and tells another neighbor what happened. And for once, the story does not shift its shape to suit the listener. Memphis. 1892, a year teaching itself how to speak without flinching, holds its breath between what it has always allowed and what it can no longer pretend not to know. The curve leans. The river shoulders by. The courthouse keeps its face. Beale Street hums, as if song could keep a building from burning. In the small room where the ink dries to a stubborn shine, a woman checks the alignment of type, lowers the platen, and decides again, as if the decision were a daily bread, that grief will not be domesticated, that witness will not apologize, that when the city offers euphemism like a cushion, she will sit on the truth instead and invite the world to stand with her. Morning leans into the window like a tired shoulder. The lamp on Ida's desk trembles, then steadies. And in that small second-floor room above Beale, a bundle of papers sits cooling on the table edges, soft with steam ink still whispering to itself. She ties them with twine twice around square knot and listens to the city arranging its noises, the clop and scrape of a dray on wet cobbles, the telegraph's nervous pecking, a hymn fragment leaking from a storefront church that hasn't yet decided to open. She runs her thumb along the top sheet, the headline meeting her like a stare, and exhales as if the page can feel the weight being lifted from her chest. A boy appears in the doorway, head too big, grin too quick, and says nothing at first, only looks at the bundle as though it might purr if he were gentle. Careful, she says, soft, almost joking, and hands it over with both palms as if passing a basin filled to the meniscus. He nods like an adult would, a solemn borrowed nod, and the bundle disappears into his arms. She watches him descend the stairs, step, pause, step, like someone counting a prayer. Then she takes the next bundle herself, because the day is long, and the street is a vein, and witness must move on 2 sets of feet. At the curb, the river smell lifts iron silt-old rope, and wraps around the boy as he turns left toward the curve. He does not shout headlines. Not today. Not with this. He simply walks with his center of gravitate tilted forward as if the news itself is pulling him. The sheets make a dry hush against his coat. A woman sweeping her stoop leans on the handle, listens to the hush, and calls after him. How much? He lowers the bundle, not all the way, never all the way, and she plucks a paper like fruit eyes scanning for the names. She already knows are inside. She doesn't thank him, not because she is ungrateful, but because she is reading before the coin leaves her palm. He pockets the coin as carefully as a note from a parent and moves on. Ida takes Beale at a slower rhythm, her hands inked at the creases, the knot of a spare bundle pressing into her forearm like a second pulse. She notices the small things, because the large things threaten to swallow her, the tilt of a hat on a barber's hook. A chalk line where children practiced letters, a window with 2 panes repaired by different hands. A streetcar trills, she steps back. The motorman looks past her as if she were a trick of light, and she returns her eyes to the walking. A grocer she knows by sight but not by name gives the smallest of nods, gratitude smuggled through a crease in the day, and she replies with the smallest of smiles because anything larger might crack. Down toward the curve, the world narrows, rail to the left, storefronts to the right, and the boy has already made his first delivery without fanfare. He does not push a paper into a hand, he waits. Lets the hand find the paper. Lets the eyes find the headline. Then moves when he feels the breath go out and come back indifferent. At People's Grocery, the bell above the door sleeps. He lifts it with his fingers so it won't ring a tiny courtesy to a place that has been rung too hard, and sets one paper on the counter where flour dust still throws its pale weather. He does not linger. He does not want to see grief before breakfast. He leaves the door as he found it shut but not closed. On the sidewalk, a woman in a dark shawl stands where shadow insists, as if the shade could soften the reading. She is older than she feels, younger than she looks, and her hands hold the paper like a letter from a ship that should have docked. She finds the names there where names should be, not buried in a paragraph like an afterthought, but standing centered, spelled without diminishment. Her mouth shapes a thank you with no sound. She folds the paper once, then again corners careful and slides it into the pocket where a kerchief would live on ordinary mornings. If someone were to ask later what the story said, she would not quote the sentences, she would only say, "It said them." That is enough. Ida stops at a door with a brass number she has never memorized. She does not need the number, the wood remembers her knuckles. A widow opens sleep crushed on one cheek, and Ida does not step in. She stays on the threshold where a visitor can leave without rearranging the furniture of a morning. The paper passes from palm to palm in a transaction that looks nothing like business and everything like breath. I put it plain, Ida says, not to defend herself, not to soften anything, but to acknowledge the risk of clarity. The widow nods. That is all a nod with no destination, and in the narrow angle of the door, Ida sees a table set for a man who cannot touch the spoon. Midday leans hard. The streetcar throws a brighter sound. Heat slows the city's grammar to a drawl. The boy stops for a biscuit, no bigger than his palm. He eats it like a small sacrament, eyes on the bundle he has tucked against his ribs, and the baker pretends not to see that the coin is short, and the boy pretends not to notice the pretending. 2 men in uniform stand at a corner like a punctuation mark that means watch yourself. They laugh too loudly at a story that needs the volume, and the boy takes a long, slow arc around their laughter, as if it were a hole in the street. He ducks into an alley to let his heart finish its work. When he steps out again, his face has chosen adulthood. Through open doors, snatches of dialogue hop like birds. They say, but I heard. No, it was. And the paper keeps interrupting with specifics, as if to rescue nouns from rumor's mouth. A barber reads between customers, holds the sheet at arm's length, adjusts his glasses, sets them on his head, reads without them, then tucks the page beneath the mirror where men brag about baseball and pretend their backs are not tired. A teacher on lunch break stands under a borrowed umbrella and reads each line twice because the first pass makes her angry and the second pass makes her steady. She buys 2 extra, one for a neighbor who cannot come out, one for a friend who left town and deserves to know that her leaving was not cowardice but weather sense. The afternoon stutters. A breeze arrives, smells of mud and somewhere else, and with it the little procession that a city produces when it chooses to acknowledge and not intervene. The slow-talking men who know the name of every deputy. The storekeeper who keeps score like a man, sharpening a blade, the boy who wants to be brave and settles for being near. They gather near the wrecked office, not the new one, not the hidden room, the old free speech door with its slit grin of a window. There is a sourness to their amusement that makes the air feel used. Ida does not go that way. She chooses the church. Inside, shadow settles on pews like soft cloth. A pastor hums to test a note, and then, seeing her in the aisle, stops humming as if caught singing to himself. She sits third pew, left side angle, where the pulpit looks less like a tower, and rests her hands on the cool varnish. The paper lies beside her, folded, then opened, then folded again, and she picks at a corner until the fiber rises like a small blister. The pastor says nothing for a long, generous stretch, the kind of silence that remembers how to hold someone. And then he asks, "What do you need?" Not, "What will you do?" Not, "What have you done?" As if the whole city were already certain of those answers, but the human-sized question. She does not answer at once. When she does, it is not an inventory. It is a sentence with only 2 nouns and a verb, time and room, to work. Evening draws lines across the street. Long shadows, bakery heat sliding out of doorways, and the boy lighter by the weight of news counts what remains. He saves one for himself, he does not know why, and tucks it into the hollow under his shirt, where boys keep hoarded treasure. He takes another to a little house off a lane where an elder sits on a chair that has learned his habits. The elder does not read. Not in the way papers expect, he holds the page to his ear, absurd, as it looks and listens to the cadence of someone else reading on the porch 2 doors down. He nods in time with a sentence he cannot see, and for a moment the whole block keeps the same rhythm. Dusk. The river becomes a sheet of tin. The lamps take over to remind the street not to vanish. Ida stands at her own window and watches smoke write its slow ciphers above rooftops. She could count the risks, the way other people count coins, the press that can be broken, the door that can be forced. The friend who will stop calling when the air around her name gets hotter than he prefers. Instead, she counts something else, the hands that passed the paper, the faces that changed shape, the breaths that decided to keep going. She thinks of the boy's careful walk, the way he kept the bundle high, sacred, a little ridiculous, and therefore perfect, and she smiles in a way that reaches her eyes. Night finds the curve. A woman shawled tighter now steps out onto a porch and sits with her paper folded on her lap, a palm spread over the headline as if to keep it from flying away. The street is almost quiet, a dog's single bark, a distant piano chopping the evening into squares, and from far off the thin wire of the telegraph hums one more message into the dark. She does not need the code to know its meaning. The city is talking about itself again. Sometimes true, sometimes practiced. She thinks of the store with the sleeping bell, of a table where a spoon still waits, of the way a name on a page can feel like a hand on your shoulder, steadying you on a step you could not take alone. In the second-floor room, the press has cooled. The rollers smell faintly sweet. The type sits in its trays like soldiers asleep between battles. Ida douses the lamp flame, shrinking color moving through amber to needlepoint blue, and lets the dark take the corners, then the ceiling, then the desk. Before the last light goes, she touches the plate where the headline lived today, taps it once with her finger, a quiet amen to the work. Outside, the boy, finally home, pulls the sheet from his shirt, smooths it on his blanket, and traces the letters with a bitten nail, until his own name, never printed, feels less alone. Memphis breathes slower now, the river telling its old story in a voice that never asks permission. The city has not changed tonight, not in the way parades and proclamations pretend, but something in its posture has shifted. A shoulder squared, a neck unbent, a mouth that once learning the shape of certain names refuses to mispronounce them. Grief has not grown smaller, no. It has learned to stand upright, to wear boots, to carry a bundle of papers down a street and make deliveries that are not salvation, but are for now enough to keep the morning honest. History tightens when you put pins on a map. When rumor becomes a place, and place becomes a pattern, and the pattern refuses to be argued with. Lay the paper flat, Tennessee bending into Mississippi rail lines, combing south and north the river, like a muscled arm flexing past the city, and begin marking what the night wanted to call an accident. The curve is not just a corner, it is a junction where commerce and confidence touched and sparked. The jail is not a building, it is a valve that can be opened from the inside when the town agrees to call a mob unknown. The rail yard where the gunshots echoed is not a neutral field, it is an in-between, far enough to pretend secrecy, near enough to borrow the city's authority. Once you see the geography, you see the method. Now put pins in the calendar. Early March, a quarrel at a doorway, arrests that slide on rail's telephone trees that know exactly whom to wake. 2 nights later, the jail's hinges learning to look away. Mourning households, performing the logistics of catastrophe. Late May, a different hinge. The free speech office splintered the type boxes, overturned the promise left on a wall that makes a woman's body into a warning. Then lecture tickets printed train berths, bought a voice crossing state lines because truth needs a wider room. Facts once gathered expand. A city that thought it could keep its story local learns that evidence takes the outbound track. Numbers do not feel, but they do convict. In that single year, the tally of lynchings in this country rises into triple digits. County by county, name by stubborn name. Some reported with theatrical invention, others with a sick briskness that tells you how practiced the ritual has become. Count not only the dead, count the habits. Count how often an accusation arrives when a black-owned business competes too well. Count how often a vigilante story borrows the same adjectives, the same cloudy motives, the same claim that no trial would have done. Count the jurisdictions where the grand jury meets and adjourns with nothing to say, as if silence were a legal conclusion. Then in a different column, count the pamphlets, the Sunday sermons, the minutes of women's clubs that take up collections for train fare, the school basements that stack broadsides to mail. Grief measures its losses, and then it measures its reach. Zoom the camera to the institutions, the respectable ones that prefer to hum rather than shout. Editors who compliment themselves on moderation, their columns set like chafing dishes where ugly meals are served under silver lids. Lawyers who promise due process as if the phrase itself could make a missing defendant rise and walk. Clergy who preach peace and mean quiet. Businessmen who urge prudence and mean capitulation. Each carries a little underlined phrase, a personal doctrine of avoidance, and each of those doctrines depends on this, that the victims remain abstract. The moment a name is repeated in a kitchen, the moment a wife places a paper on a table and says the name aloud twice, those doctrines wobble. Then they realize that a ledger maintained by a woman with a press can pry the word order off its pedestal and expose the gears underneath, push deeper into the economics. People's grocery was revenue, not symbol. Every sack of flour rung up represented credit-pooled risk. shared a balance sheet that contradicted the story of dependency the city preferred to tell. When that store was broken and the men were taken, the rival ledger fattened by default. This is how terror bills itself as competition. This is how a rope pretends to be a receipt. But watch what happened next. The counter-economy of refusal. Men took the train west to Arkansas, farther to Oklahoma Territory, because a manager's last advice read like a map: there is no justice here. Take your children somewhere justice can be learned again. Houses emptied, storefronts closed. Streetcars felt the absence in their coin boxes. The merchants who cheered the wrecking found fewer buyers by harvest. A crusade can begin in ink, and then it can switch languages and speak in balance sheets. The case file widens into an atlas. Letters arrive from St. Louis. We read it, sister. Keep the names. From Pittsburgh, send a bundle. Our pastor will preach the numbers. From Boston, a hall is yours on Thursday. From the other side of the ocean, a polite hand on heavy paper. If you come, we will listen. If you write, we will print. If you name the pattern, we will carry the name back to you in our newspapers so that your city has to see itself as the world sees it. Then they realized that local habits cannot be defended in a room without local air. In London, in Glasgow, on church pulpits where the hymnals smelled of coal smoke. The story of three grocers at a streetcar bend ended the illusion that the American problem was a private family quarrel. Export the facts, import accountability. Return to the rhetoric, the unwritten law that so many men invoked like a charm. Its grammar is tidy, the claim of protection, the leap to accusation, the sentence passed without a bench. On paper it sounds like chivalry. In practice it is architecture, a scaffolding. You can hang any envy on and call it virtue. When the woman at the press writes that out, line by line, she is not insulting anyone's daughters, she is denying anyone the right to weaponize them. She says aloud what decent men know and have been trained not to say that crimes must be tried in courts, that consent is not a pretext for murder, that economic competition dressed in a mask is still theft. Then they realized that her argument does not request belief. It demands arithmetic. Check the dates, check the ledgers, check the proximity of a black success story to the sudden emergence of a warning to the community. If the pattern repeats, you are not looking at weather. You are looking at policy. Follow the paper trail, the kind that lives in kitchens, not courthouses. A widow's letter, careful as embroidery, naming the hour not midnight, as the paper had it, but nearer to dawn. A teacher's attendance book, 3 empty lines, where 3 children returned and then did not. Sickness was the excuse, but grief was the reason. A shoemaker's receipt, the last purchase of a man whose feet would walk no further, dated the afternoon before the jailhouse visit. Each scrap contradicts some convenient vagueness. Each scrap is a small rebellion against the grammar of erasure. When gathered patiently, plainly, they make a ledger no judge can strike. This is the secondary layer of fact, that a crusade needs not numbers alone, but proofs rude and ordinary enough to remain true when rhetoric has cooled. Consider, too, the counter-voices in the black press and pulpit, not dissent from the goal, but calibration of the means. Some urged caution, we must live to print another day. Some argued for migration as policy. Starve the city of our taxes and watch its manners improve. Some proposed boycotts, theaters, streetcars, markets, precise as a military operation. The woman at the center listened, re-aimed her pages, sometimes urging the West, sometimes urging the courts, always urging the habit of naming. A movement is not a monologue. It is a fugue, themes entering late, leaving early, dividing, and returning with new harmonies. The fact layer in a fugue is not a footnote. It is a beat you can march to when the street gets loud. Widen again to the years that follow. The slim pamphlet multiplies first into a speech that carries a folded map of the South in its pocket, then into a longer book whose tables take away the freedom of guesswork. The counting becomes public, not just the dead, but the pretexts, the counties, the sheriffs who cannot remember the prosecutors who cannot find their pencils, the editors who can always find a euphemism. The geography of terror acquires coordinates, and when a thing acquires coordinates, it loses its magic. It can be met. It can be moved. You can set other markers nearby, freedmen's schools, black colleges, women's clubs, labor halls, and watch how the lines cross. Where education rises, terror rises to meet it. Where mutual aid builds, night riders recruit. Where names are printed, masks grow thicker. Then they realized that visibility is not only risk, it is shield. Pull the lens back to Memphis. Watch the feedback loop. The more the city resented outside eyes, the more its officials promised improvements, commissioned statements, escorts, reforms that sounded like remedies and behaved like postponements. But postponement changes something too. It buys time for neighbors to learn each other's courage. It buys a season for a new paper to find a new press room. It buys a journey for a speaker to persuade a stranger who will persuade a friend who will send a letter back addressed simply to the woman who named it. The file bulks until even those who hate her must know her statistics better than their catechism. She has turned grief into an instrument, and instruments once tuned invite other hands. We finish this layer not with triumph, but with clarity. The grocery does not reopen under its old owners. The families do not regain what was taken. The city does not suddenly blush. But the ledger is different. It contains the pins and the days and the low, ordinary scraps that a court would call inadmissible and a community would call our proof. It contains, too, the understanding that to prevent the next night, you must interrupt the story one paragraph earlier at the rumor, at the arrest, at the editorial that begins to sand the edges off a crime. That is what the Crusade becomes, in its second register, an early warning system made of pages and people. And here at the edge of payoff, a final realization settles in like evening. You can measure a city by what it demands to see, and by what it refuses to let vanish. Memphis thought its river erased. The press taught it that paper remembers longer than water. The fact layer stands stubborn, unhandsome, invulnerable to charm, and the folklore layer that walks beside it, the dreams, the hymns, the porch stories, is no longer asked to carry proof alone. Side by side they move forward. Toward the bridge we must cross next, where all this counting and naming and mapping will strain against the old machinery until something gives, and a crusade already born finds its first undeniable turn. There is a moment when the room leans towards you, when breath, paper, and bodies share a single rhythm. And in that moment, a story that began in a grocery at the curve stands up in a hall 3 states away and says its own name. The stage is bare. A lectern, a glass of water, a stack of thin pages that could slip if the hand shakes. She does not let them slip. She tells the road from quarrel to jail to rail yard, not as thunder, not as fate, but as steps a city chose. She reads the arithmetic with a voice trained by ink dates that refuse to move corners, that refuse to blur names, that refuse to shrink. You can feel the architecture of excuse groan. The audience does not clap in the right places. There are no right places. But their silence grows muscular. Silence can be a lever too. Then it happens, the click you hear only once, and remember forever when a local wound acquires a national skeleton. A stranger stands to speak careful, unremarkable, and promises to carry the names farther than the river. A woman presses coins into a basket with a hand that looks like your grandmother's, and the basket grows heavy enough to pay for trains, for rooms, for light on borrowed desks. A man at the back who came to be skeptical lingers in the aisle, shocked to discover that skepticism cannot lift the weight of what he has just heard. A pastor writes a line inside the front cover of his Bible. Not a verse, a date. Afterward, in the narrow corridor that smells of dust and wool, someone whispers the sentence terror hates most. We will print this too. the story leaves its first skin. It stops being what happened to those 3 men over there and starts being what this ritual has made of us. A pamphlet slips under doors that have never been opened to a black visitor. A rebuttal letter, prim wounded, fails to land because the room has learned how much work euphemism must do to stand upright. In another city, a woman who cannot travel becomes a post office for the truth-copying, addressing, wrapping. Her kitchen turns into a little harbor where the pages are launched. In another, a printer closes his shop for an hour to argue with his typesetter about which comma does the least harm to a sentence that already hurts. When the devil works in details, so does deliverance. Push the camera forward, a harbor gray with coal smoke, a deck slick with rain, a ship pulling out, while a woman on the rail learns the feel of sea wind on a vow. Across the water halls, with long names pews that creak papers that weigh more than their size, the same arithmetic is laid out again, steadier now. No theatrics, no sermonry, just the method, the motive, the ledger. The room goes quiet in a way that feels like the world drawing a breath. The questions after are sharper. Not, is this true? But how is it allowed? Not, what is to be done? But what will you do with us if we join you? And suddenly the thing that called itself a local quarrel is an international embarrassment, the kind that travels back home faster than a rumor and arrives at official desks wearing a foreign stamp. Men who thought themselves immune to shame discover that shame is a currency abroad, and they are operating at a loss. Back in Memphis, the temperature changes without the weather moving. You can feel the chafe in editorials that overreach their own patience. You can hear it in meetings where men who never used the word policy now use it twice in a sentence, as if to prove something to an invisible observer. Officials promise investigations like men promise diets, earnest, specific, destined to be postponed. But postponement, as we have learned, buys time for other machinery. Teachers set aside 5 minutes at the end of class for current events, and the current becomes a river under the floorboards. Choirs add a verse about courage without moving the melody. Mothers practice a new ritual at the stove, say the names out loud, while the kettle climbs so that children learn the spelling by steam and habit. In rooms where no one would say lynching last year, the word enters with its hat off and is asked to sit. Then they realized, not they but we, that naming is not the end of the work. It is the condition under which work stops collapsing. You can boycott a streetcar only after you've mapped its route in the body, whose hands pull the fare, whose eyes refuse the gaze, whose feet walk when the nickel is a tax on dignity. You can starve a market only after you have counted what your neighbors can endure and what they cannot. You can leave a city only after the calculus of staying turns into a ledger of theft. The Crusade, which looked at first like a pen, reveals itself as a switchboard, lines running to pastors, teachers, printers, widows, boys who deliver news, like sacrament men who will quietly drive you to a train at midnight and not tell even their wives until morning. There is a scene you may have lived something like it. Doors opening on a hall where the air is hot with speech and cotton lint. A table near the entrance holds pencils in a jar and a ledger in which people write their names, who have no habit of registering anything but births and deaths. Tonight they register intent. One woman signs, "For my sister." A man signs, "For a boy I used to be." A girl not yet of voting age writes only a place the curve as if the place could join. The talk is not rehearsed. It moves like weather, and yet it keeps returning to one isobar. What will we do together that we cannot do alone? When the chair calls the vote, no one tallies hands. The vote is in the bodies leaning forward. The payoff is not a parade, though. There will be marches someday, and not a verdict, though. There will be lawsuits, and not a single golden sentence. Though there are sentences here that will live longer than their paper. The payoff is an alteration in posture that accumulates into policy. A policeman thinks twice because he knows a journalist has sharpened her pencil somewhere nearby. A judge trims his sentence of its moral scenery because he has learned that adjectives are watched. An editor bored with his own cleverness prints a paragraph that finally lets nouns do their work. A courthouse janitor saves a scrap from a bin because he recognizes the names and does not trust the bin. The city does not confess. It adjusts. Adjustment is not justice, but it is the angle at which justice can be levered. And what of the woman whose grief began this? She learns the price of insisting exile that tastes like air. You did not choose friends who become careful as if caution were a luxury. They can spend nights when a window bang is only wind, and still the heart rehearses. She learns the terms of persistence allies who start as audiences' platforms, that start as borrowed desks. Wealth that arrives in small envelopes with big handwriting. She learns the patience of building an index of saving clippings that no one thinks will matter until the day they do. She learns the surplus of courage that hides in places no one checks in choir lofts, cloakrooms, the underside of a baker's counter. And she learns this is the secret most movements discover too late, that the most radical act is often administrative. Keep the list, keep the receipts, keep the names where heat cannot smudge them. The river watches pretending as always to forget, and the press answers with its own current. New pages, new towns, new hands. A minister writes to say the pews emptied the moment the sermon ended, but the foyer filled, because people wanted to sign something, anything, everything. A seamstress sends a letter stitched through the margin with blue thread. I have no coin. I have this thread. Use it to bind your pages when the glue fails. A porter hides a parcel of pamphlets among uniforms and carries them across state lines with the calm of a man who has learned how to be invisible in plain sight. When we say movement, we mean this an economy of risk and provision so granular that it feels like daily life because it is. Climax is often mistaken for explosion spectacle reversal trumpets. Here it is a pressure change you feel in your lungs. The city discovers that its favorite incantations have lost their power in certain rooms. The country discovers that the map of its sanctuaries has shrunk. A rumor rises and meets a wall of named facts, not a wall built of purity or rage, a wall built of patience. A night rider hesitates. A deputy hesitates. A neighbor. This is the quietest revolution declines to join. The unknown parties become men with faces, and faces are expensive to carry into daylight. In the ledger of harm, the debit column still fills too fast. But on the margin, a new notation appears resisted, and that is a hinge on which futures turn. Stand here with her, in the doorway between what the city tried to keep private and what it can no longer conceal, and listen to the simple machines of change. A desk lamp turned up, a hand press inked, a ledger open to a fresh page, a hall rented by women who will scrub it at midnight to get their deposit back, a boy hat too big walking careful with a bundle held high. This is not a miracle. This is maintenance at scale. And the miracle, if we are allowed the word at all, is that maintenance, humble, repeating, unglamorous, can tilt a nation's habit 1/2 degree away from terror and toward the record. The river exhales. The hall empties. The lamp burns low. She gathers the pages not as trophies, but as tools, and places them in a bag that has learned the shape of their weight. Outside night has taken the corners and left the middle of the street to the brave and the foolish. She steps into the middle, not because she loves danger, not because she mistrusts sidewalks, but because the shortest route from grief to change is a straight line. You walk with your head up. Tomorrow there will be more names to print more rooms, to fill more doors that refuse to open until the hinge is named. Tonight, for a breath, the payoff is this: a pattern exposed, a city unsettled, a woman still standing, and a chorus, miles wide, learning how to take her vow into its own mouth and mean it. Morning again? Not that same March morning, but one that has inherited its silence. Memphis looks the same from a distance. The river still folding light against its current, the courthouse clock still pretending it measures progress, but beneath the surface the air has changed texture. Time does this. It doesn't heal, it rewires. And the old fear that used to move like smoke now has to cross through thicker breath. Years turn the 1890s become a rough decade stitched together by migration routes and memory. Families take the rail west to St. Louis, to Kansas City, to Oklahoma Territory, carrying their small possessions and one large invisible cargo, the story. They don't call it activism. They call it keeping track. In Sunday kitchens, women fold scraps of the free speech into recipe books. A child learns to read by sounding out the names on that March page. A pastor in another county builds his sermon around a single verb stand. Because that's what she said. And somewhere between the hymn and the benediction, a congregation finds itself saying it back. Meanwhile, the city learns how to look at its own reflection. The sight of People's Grocery becomes another shop, another owner, another sign. But every April the dust there seems to lift differently, as if it remembers being unsettled by truth. The rail yard where the air cracked with gunfire becomes a yard for freight, and men walk it daily without knowing what their boots are walking over, yet sometimes at dusk. When a train horn carries too long, the sound drifts with a faint human note, and someone on a porch will pause, as if a page had turned itself. Ida keeps moving trains, pulpits, borrowed rooms, a passport that never quite stops working. She writes in Chicago now, the ink darker, the sentences tighter. She learns how to fight on two fronts, the lynching that hides behind night and the indifference that hides behind etiquette. She builds alliances, loses friends, collects letters addressed simply to the lady who told us. She speaks until her throat turns gravel, then writes until the pen blunts. By the new century, her name lives in footnotes and in whispers, depending on who is doing the remembering. But the crusade that lives in verbs. Each time a journalist prints a name without apology. Each time a mother insists on the full story in front of children. Each time a jury takes longer than expected because someone refuses to look away. Her cadence continues quiet, as a press turning under a blanket. History keeps adding layers. 1909. A new century flexes its conscience, and from Chicago's tangle of tenements and ambition, the NAACP is born. Its first manifesto echoes the same arithmetic: no more hidden names, no more convenient weather reports to explain human storms. Ida's pen is there, blunt but steady, tracing the line from the curve to this new organization that will inherit both her data and her defiance. They quote her without attribution sometimes, to make the words feel communal, sometimes because her courage is hard to hold in a single mouth. She does not mind. The work was never hers alone. By 1921, another city burns Tulsa, a mirror held to Memphis 3 decades later. Planes overhead this time, the fire multiplied the arithmetic too familiar. And in the char of that later ruin, reporters find pamphlets printed from the same plates, worn but legible, bearing her sentences. A girl in Tulsa reads them by firelight and writes her own headline in a notebook: "We are still here." The echo continues, not as nostalgia, but as rehearsal, each generation relearning the pitch of courage until it fits the throat of its own moment. Back in Memphis, the archives begin to fill first with whispers, then with paper. Letters, affidavits, marginal notes, all the little resistances that used to hide behind stove doors. In a downtown library, a clerk discovers a drawer labeled Miscellaneous 1892 and opens it to find that nothing is miscellaneous about grief when someone has cared enough to catalog it. The ledgers become exhibits, the exhibits become memorials, and a century later, the city finally hangs a bronze marker at the curve. Tourists pass, pause, lower their voices. Children trace the names with their fingers, and their parents translate the silence. This is what happened. And this is who refused to let it disappear. Fact and folklore by now are inseparable. Some say the free speech press was lost, melted down, scattered. Others say its rollers were buried in a yard on Beale and still turn when the ground trembles in summer storms. Some claim the river itself took the ink, and that's why its water runs dark after heavy rain. There are singers who swear that when they hum certain lines of "We Shall Overcome," they hear a second rhythm underneath the slow, relentless beat of a hand press. Maybe it's fancy, maybe it's memory, or maybe history, when told enough times, begins to keep its own time. What matters is the echo, not as haunting, but as heartbeat. The echo in a lecture hall when a young woman's voice cuts through noise to describe injustice without flinching. The echo in a newsroom when an editor decides that a dead man's name deserves the front page. The echo in a courtroom when a juror refuses to nod along. The echo in every community that learns to hold its own record, its own receipts, its own proof. Grief multiplied by time has become muscle, and yet the lesson lingers softly like a drum. Under snow, memory does not perform miracles, it performs maintenance. Someone still has to wind the press, to re-ink the plates, to teach the children what the words cost. The rivers are full of stories, but paper still needs hands. If you visit Memphis now, walk the bend. Listen to the rails, you can feel her presence not as a ghost, but as a temperature, the warm persistence of someone who decided that truth, once set in type, should never go cold. So here we end, and begin again. Stand with her, with Ida, with the boy carrying the papers, with the widows folding them into hymnals. Stand with every name the river tried to drag under, and every voice that kept it afloat. And before you leave this story, add your own small line to the record. Tell us where you're watching from and the minute you found yourself holding your breath. Because this history, like the river, keeps flowing only when someone upstream remembers to keep it moving. Thank you for listening, for standing, for remembering that grief, when written, does not fade, it becomes witness. And witness, once shared, becomes the quiet, unstoppable sound of a nation finally learning to hear itself.